He had the kind of confidence that doesn't ask permission, dark hair slightly tousled, sleeves rolled to his elbows. A faint scent of cedar clinging to him. He studied me with unsettling calm, as if measuring how fast the truth would sink in. I tried to speak, but all that came out was a thin, unsure, "I'm sorry." "What?" He leaned back, one arm resting casually on the chair, and said, "You heard me? Your boyfriend. Tyler Grant. He's been seeing my wife, Lana, for 7 months. I thought you deserved to know before they take another weekend trip together." My stomach tightened, but my mind stayed oddly still, like the seconds before a storm. I wanted to deny it, but there was something in his tone that left no space for disbelief. He slid his phone across the small table. On the screen was a photo, Tyler's unmistakable smile, his arm around a woman I recognized only faintly from social media. The same woman tagged in posts about charity events and gallery openings. "Her name's Lana Reeves," he said, watching my face carefully. "I've been following the trail for weeks, credit card records, location pings, messages she didn't bother deleting. I didn't expect to find you at the end of it." I stared at the image until my vision blurred, the world shrinking to the faint hum of espresso machines and distant laughter that suddenly felt cruel in its normalcy. "How do you know who I am?" I finally managed, though it felt like the least important question. He smiled, just slightly, but there was no warmth in it. "Because I did my homework. You live 2 blocks from the river, teach at the art college, and order the same cinnamon latte every Saturday at 2. You're nothing like her." Which makes it worse somehow. I felt heat rush to my face. Not from embarrassment, but from the violation of realizing how transparent my routines had been to someone else's investigation. He wasn't gloating, he was just tired. A man burned by too much truth. I pushed his phone back toward him without looking again. "Why tell me this?" I asked, though part of me already knew. He let out a breath that sounded almost like a laugh. "Because I thought maybe you'd want to stop being the last to know. And because misery—" He paused long enough to meet my eyes. "Loves company." He slipped a small card from his pocket and placed it beside my untouched coffee. "My name's Dylan Reeves. If you want to compare notes or just make them wonder where we are, for once, call me." He stood, adjusted his jacket, and walked out without waiting for my response. I sat there staring at the empty chair, my hands cold around the cup I'd forgotten to drink from. The card on the table was simple: his name, his number, nothing else. The latte had gone bitter, the kind of bitterness that feels almost cleansing. And in that small corner cafe, surrounded by the quiet chatter of strangers, I realized my life had just split clean in two. When I got back to my apartment, everything looked the same but felt suddenly borrowed. The framed prints I'd hung over the sofa, the pale rug we'd argued about buying, even the faint scent of Tyler's cologne, each detail hummed with a quiet accusation. I moved through the space with deliberate calm, touching the edges of a life that no longer seemed mine. On the kitchen counter lay his tablet, half hidden under a stack of gym schedules, its screen glowing faintly with an unread notification that shouldn't have been there. I unlocked it without hesitation, the old password sliding into place like muscle memory. The inbox opened to a thread labeled Savannah Bay. At first, it was only hotel confirmations dates that matched the weekends he'd claimed to visit his brother. Then I saw her name, Lana Reeves, written casually in the contact line. The two of them exchanging messages about what wine to bring and which room had the better view. The words blurred, but the meaning didn't. It was all too ordinary. Too easy. I scrolled further, finding a photo Tyler on a balcony, his hand brushing against a strand of blonde hair I now recognized from the picture Dylan had shown me. I closed the tablet and felt something inside me settle rather than break. In his closet, a small gift bag tucked behind folded shirts caught my eye. Inside was a bottle of expensive perfume, still wrapped. The receipt dated a week ago. Address 2L, Reeves. My pulse stayed steady as I traced the handwriting on the note card that read, "Next weekend can't come soon enough." It was the neat, controlled script of a man who believed he would never be caught. I set it back where I found it. Aware that the silence in the room had changed, it was no longer peaceful. It was charged. When my phone rang, the sound was so sudden it startled me. Dylan's voice came through, low and even. "I take it you found something." I answered yes, though the word felt inadequate. He said he had more evidence messages, a video, and that if I wanted to see it, he'd be at a small bar on King Street around 8. His tone carried no triumph, only exhaustion. "Sometimes it's better to know everything at once," he added before hanging up. I stood there for a moment, staring at the reflection of myself in the dark window, wondering when I'd last looked this calm while my life was collapsing. I poured a glass of water, the action mechanical, and sat at the table where Tyler liked to leave motivational quotes scribbled on napkins. Tonight, one lay there waiting. The ink smudged slightly at the edges. Trust builds everything. The irony was almost beautiful. I folded the napkin in half, tucked it into my coat pocket, and turned off the light. The night outside smelled of rain, and as I locked the door behind me, I realized the difference between denial and clarity was only a few passwords apart. Dylan was already there when I arrived, sitting at a small table near the back where the light fell soft and uneven. He looked up as I approached, his expression steady but not guarded, and said, "You came." I told him I didn't plan to at first. That part of me wanted to pretend ignorance still protected me. He nodded like he understood and slid his laptop toward me, the screen alive with muted images that didn't need sound to explain themselves. On the video, Lana opened the door to a familiar figure, her hand brushing against the same jacket I'd ironed a week ago. Dylan said quietly, "This was 2 nights ago. She told me she was meeting her sister." I kept my eyes on the screen, watching Tyler's movements, the way he touched her like he'd done it 1,000 times. "You recorded them?" I asked. Not accusing, just surprised. "I had to know," he answered, because I couldn't live with half-truths anymore. I told him I wasn't sure if I admired him or pitied both of us. He leaned back, studying me in the dim light. "You don't look shocked," he said, and I replied that I'd already seen enough to make this feel like confirmation, not discovery. He smiled faintly. "Then you're ahead of me. I'm still trying to remember when love turned into surveillance." I said maybe it happened the first time we stopped believing what our partners said. He lifted his glass, nodded once, and said, "To clarity." Then, I hesitated before clinking mine against his. The sound small but final. He asked if I'd confronted Tyler yet, and I told him no. That silence was the only weapon I had left. "He thinks I'm oblivious," I said, "and maybe that's my advantage." Dylan looked impressed. "You're calmer than I expected," he said. I told him calm was just exhaustion with better posture. That made him laugh. The first real sound of the night that didn't feel heavy. "You're not like her," he said softly, meaning Lana. "She needs chaos to feel alive." I looked at him and said, "Then maybe we're both done mistaking noise for passion." He studied the rim of his glass, then said, "You know, I thought about confronting them both, making a scene, getting it out of my system." I asked why he hadn't, and he said, "Because pain deserves privacy, not an audience." I told him maybe truth did too. We sat in silence for a while, both knowing there was nothing left to say that could make it less true. Finally, he asked, "What will you do now?" I told him I didn't know yet. but I wanted to see the look on their faces when the control they'd built started to slip. "If you ever want help with that," he said. "I'm an engineer. I know how to make things collapse the right way." I smiled. Not at the threat, but at the precision in his voice. The quiet promise beneath it. When I left the bar, the air outside felt sharp and new, like it belonged to a different version of me, one that had finally stopped asking why. Tyler was already home when I walked in, barefoot, scrolling through his phone like a man with nothing to hide. He looked up with that casual smile he used on clients and said, "Hey, you're late." "Everything okay?" I told him it was. That I just needed air. And his relief came too fast. Too eager. He wrapped an arm around my waist, his voice low against my neck, asking if I wanted to order takeout. Like routine could patch what was already gone. I pulled away gently and asked, "Do you ever wonder how much of yourself you can hide before you turn into someone unrecognizable?" He laughed softly, confused, and said, "You've been reading too many of your students' essays again." I told him maybe I had. Maybe I was just tired of stories where people lie to themselves and call it love. He frowned, sensing something off, but not enough to see the shape of it. "You're acting strange," he said. Reaching for my hand, I let him take it, then pulled it back. "I just realized I've been living in a version of us that only exists in my head," I said, my voice even. He followed me into the bedroom, his tone changing. "Mara, what's this about?" I told him I was leaving for a while, that I needed to figure out who I'd been before everything blurred together. "Leaving," he repeated, as if the word were foreign. I picked up the small suitcase from the closet, the one he never noticed because he never looked closely at anything. "It's not forever," I said, though I already knew it was. He shook his head, smiling that tight, practiced smile. "You're overthinking. We're fine." I met his eyes and said, "We were fine because I stopped asking questions." He reached out again, and I stepped back before he could touch me. "Mara, whatever's bothering you, we can fix it." I told him there was nothing left to fix. Only things to stop pretending about. His confusion hardened into irritation. "So that's it, you just walk out," I said yes. And he laughed without humor. "You'll regret this," he muttered. I smiled faintly. "Maybe. But at least the regret will be mine." I walked past him to the door, leaving my keys on the counter beside the bowl of fruit he'd bought for appearances. Before I closed it, I turned and said, "You don't have to lie anymore, Tyler. The truth already packed its bags." Then I stepped into the quiet hallway, lighter than I'd been in years. A week later, Dylan called and said, "They're meeting at my place, the one I moved out of." She told me she needed space to think, but I know exactly what that means. I asked what he wanted to do, and he said, "Nothing theatrical, just truth delivered in person." When I agreed to go, he said quietly, "Then let's make sure they remember this conversation more than anything they ever whispered to each other." His voice carried no anger, only precision, and that made it sharper. When we walked in, they were already arguing, their words colliding mid-air until the silence that followed our arrival sliced through it. Tyler froze first, his mouth half open, then said, "Mara, what are you doing here?" I told him. I could ask the same question. Lana turned toward Dylan with narrowed eyes. "You had no right to come back here," she snapped. He smiled without warmth. "It's still my house until the papers are signed, so I have every right. You, on the other hand, are just a guest who overstayed." Tyler tried to recover, saying, "Look, this isn't what it looks like." I told him that was exactly what it looked like. and probably what it had looked like every time they thought no one was watching. Lana crossed her arms and said, "This is pathetic. You came here for what?" "Revenge," Dylan replied evenly. "Closure. But revenge will do if it shows up." Tyler muttered that this was childish. And I said, "Childish is pretending I didn't see the photos. The receipts. The same perfume you hid under your gym clothes." He blinked, the lie forming before the thought. "You went through my things," he asked. "You went through me first." I answered. Lana's tone turned condescending. "You both need to calm down. Relationships fall apart. That's life." Dylan stepped closer to her, his voice suddenly quiet. "Falling apart is when something breaks on its own. You dismantled it piece by piece." She rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. Don't act like a saint. You were never around." He nodded. "And you were never faithful. Seems we're both consistent." Tyler looked between us, desperate for an exit. "This doesn't have to get ugly," he said. But I laughed softly and told him, "It already is. And you painted it that way." Dylan reached into his pocket, pulled out his phone, and pressed play. The sound filled the room, Tyler's voice, low and reckless, saying he couldn't wait for another weekend. Lana's laughter threading through it. Tyler lunged forward, saying, "Turn that off." Dylan didn't. "I want you both to hear yourselves. It's strange, isn't it? How much uglier love sounds when honesty enters the room." Lana hissed, "You're cruel." He smiled faintly. "No, I'm finished." She turned to me then, her composure cracking. "You think this makes you better? You'll never trust anyone again." I said, "Maybe not. But at least I won't lie to myself about who they are." Tyler tried one last time. "Mata, listen. I made a mistake. It didn't mean anything." I told him that was the only truth he'd spoken, because nothing about him had meant anything for a long time. "You don't have to forgive me," he said. I looked at him and replied, "Good. Because I don't intend to." Dylan closed the phone and slipped it away. "I think we're done here," he said quietly. And I nodded. As we turned to leave, Lana shouted after us, "You'll regret this." I stopped in the doorway and said, "No. That's your department." Then we stepped out into the fading light, leaving them behind with their own voices still echoing through the empty house. Proof enough of everything they'd destroyed without help from us. 6 months later, the noise had faded, replaced by a stillness that didn't feel empty. I had moved into a small apartment near the art district, a second-floor space that smelled of paint and old wood. And for the first time in years, every choice inside it was mine. My days became slower but clearer. I taught again. Started a weekend workshop for students who wanted to build spaces that felt like truth instead of design. The silence between classes felt like recovery, not loneliness. Word about Tyler reached me through friends who still worked out at his gym. He had lost most of his clients, they said, after rumors spread about his affair with a married woman. When I heard, I didn't feel triumphant, only distant, like someone watching a stranger's downfall from across the street. Lana, I was told, had been fired from her PR job after her company found out she'd used client accounts to fund trips with him. It all unraveled predictably, the way things do when built on borrowed lies. Dylan and I stayed in touch. Not constantly, but enough to know the other was still standing. One evening he called and said, "I finally sold the house." I asked if it felt like losing something or gaining peace. And he said, "A little of both, but mostly peace." I told him I understood. He asked how my classes were going, and I said they were full, that people seemed drawn to rebuilding things that had been broken. He paused for a moment, then said, Maybe that's why we met. We were both architects of damage before we learned to restore. We met again a few weeks later, halfway between Charleston and Asheville. A quiet cafe that overlooked a wide stretch of highway and sky. He looked lighter, his eyes less guarded. "You look happy," he said. And I told him I wasn't sure it was happiness. Just a kind of calm that doesn't need permission. He smiled and said, "That's rarer." I asked if he ever heard from Lana, and he shook his head. "She tried once." But I let the silence answer. I said that silence was underrated. "It's the only thing that can't be misquoted," he replied. We walked for a while afterward. The evening thick with the smell of pine. I told him I'd been offered a chance to collaborate with a design institute in Georgia and that I was considering it. "You should," he said. "Starting new doesn't mean starting over." I nodded, realizing he was right. The life I had now wasn't a replacement for the one that ended. It was what happened after the wreckage was cleared. I looked at him and said, "It feels strange, but I don't hate them anymore." He smiled faintly. "Then they've already lost." When I returned home that night, I stood by the window watching the city lights stretch along the river. The reflection staring back wasn't someone waiting for an apology or closure. Just someone who had survived herself. I thought of the line I once wrote in a student's notebook. "Design is about subtraction, until what's left finally feels honest." It felt like the truest thing I'd ever said. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever walked away from something that once defined you, know that it wasn't loss, it was liberation disguised as ending. I hope you find your calm where truth feels weightless again. Stay. Subscribe. And keep walking toward the life that finally fits.